Our first tipping point tonight: if the facts show that minorities are not more disenfranchised than white people when voter ID laws are in place, if voter turnout does not decrease when voter ID laws are in place, why do liberals oppose voter ID? Liberals use 5 arguments against voter ID. Number 1, it discriminates against minorities, they say. Number 2, fewer people turn out to vote. Number 3, it's a poll tax, they claim. Number 4, non-government ID should be good enough. And number 5, voter fraud simply doesn't exist anyway, according to the left. So why go to all the trouble of forcing people to prove they are who they claim they are before they vote? But what if all those arguments were empty? What if we have answers to prove they are not valid issues? Would liberals change their minds on voter ID? And if not, why not? Joining me now, the president of the San Diego chapter of the National Action Network, the Reverend Shane Harris. Reverend Harris, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me on this Good Friday. It's good to see you on this Good Friday.
It's good to see you, too. And I want to start with the question of the day, Reverend Harris. You heard me say it in the introduction: if the facts show that minorities are not actually more disenfranchised than white people are when voter ID laws are in place, if voter turnout does not decrease when voter ID laws are in place, why do liberals oppose voter ID?
Well, first of all, Liz, thank you for having me on this subject. I think it's a subject that both liberals and conservatives need to have together. We need to have this conversation because the reality is this, is that focusing on making more barriers or making less barriers takes away the initial focus of voter engagement around the country and engaging young people. But I think that in the premise of the question you asked me, I think we definitely got to ask ourselves the question: when we are stacking barriers on top of people, does it make it more difficult? And the question is yes. When you look at
let me interject for a second. Do you have studies that show that fewer people turn out to vote when voter ID laws are in place?
The voter ID case in Texas, what had happened previous under the Obama administration, who really launched the federal probe into Texas, and what had happened with the voter ID laws showed that minorities were held under standard and were challenged to vote because of the stacking of laws, making it more difficult to vote. In 29 states, over 87
I don't think that actually ever happened, though. That's the thing. I'm not sure they ever have that proof. I have a study here. This was done in 2008 by the University of Missouri. They studied the state of Indiana. Indiana, of course, had passed a voter ID law. They studied the election that happened immediately after the voter ID law was implemented, and they found that not only did people not face these barriers that you speak of, voter turnout actually increased. I would submit, arguably because people had confidence in the integrity of their vote. So if the facts show us that voter turnout does not decrease, that's not exactly a barrier to people to vote.
It's a barrier when you start stacking more and more and more laws and more baggage on top of what the baggage that's already there. It's already difficult, and there's already disparities in minority communities. So to now stack extra laws on top of that people have to be ID'd, mind you.
It's not just IDs for black people or for minorities. It's equal across the board. Everyone should have to prove who they are.
Yeah, everyone should have. But when you have to prove who you are and add extra baggage on top of that, there's a problem. Liz, you have to really think about it. Why do we change the game in the middle of the game? When the game starts, the rules should not be changed in the middle. They should be changed at the very beginning so that it's a fair game. You can't come in the middle of the game and start changing the rules. And that
wait a second. Let me ask you, though. If someone walked into the polling place where you personally go to cast your ballot, and they said that they are the Reverend Shane Harris. They say that they live at the address that you live at, and they're not required to prove that they are who you are. Your vote could be stolen. Doesn't that bother you?
But my question to conservatives and folks is, tell us, show us the cases. Give us more than one case. Give us several cases where this has happened. They can't do it.
No, I'm glad you asked that question. I think it's important to do it.
But we can bring the cases where it has showed that minorities are in disparity, where the federal DOJ came in on
No, wait a second.
It clearly showed that the voter ID laws in Texas made it disparities upon minorities in those communities.
Reverend Shane, let me ask you this question, though. This is from a Reuters study.
Who's really going in and using other people's names? I mean, come on, we've got to use the real data.
James O'Keefe did sting videos where he went into Michigan and voted as Eminem, the rapper. It can be done. It's easy to be done. But I want to share with you this Reuters study. It says, and this addresses, of course, the fact that voter ID would be discriminatory to minorities versus whites. But this Reuters study says that black people, 3% of black people don't have government IDs versus only 2% of white people. So obviously that's within the margin of error for the study to begin with. But if you do the math then, because there's more white people in the country, more white people would be quote unquote denied their right to vote based off of not having an ID than black people would.
Yeah, but see, what we're looking at and what we're having a conversation about is we're having a conversation about disparities in different communities. In white communities, there's more of an establishment of voting. That goes all the way back to history. In black and brown communities and minority communities, there's a history of being left behind. There's a history
right,
of
but what
being
does ID have to do with
vote.
that? What does voter ID have to do with that? That just protects the integrity of their votes.
Because minorities have had to fight for the right to have the right to vote in this country.
Voter ID does not prevent them.
Right before anybody else.
Right, and no one's arguing that. No one's arguing that. That's an egregious part of the history of our country. I'm glad that we're past that part, but I don't see in this day and age how voter ID,
we're not past that
everyone who's a citizen of our nation, regardless of their gender, their origin, their race, their skin color, is allowed to vote. Our country is past the point of certain people of certain races not being allowed to vote. But I don't see, wait a second, let me finish what I'm saying. I don't see how voter ID plays into this. If the numbers show us that it's not a significant number more black people who don't have IDs than white people, and if voter turnout does not in fact decrease with voter ID laws, it's not really a valid argument from the left that minorities are disenfranchised by voter ID.
But you got to be honest here, Liz. When you're talking about in different states, there's different rules for getting IDs. But when you talk about being, having certain felonies or having certain things where it makes disparities in certain communities, it's difficult to get an ID.
I mean, don't you find that insulting to minorities to suggest that they're somehow less capable than white people of obtaining a government ID, though?
No, because
I mean, that's what you're saying. That's what you're saying, that it's too hard to get a government ID.
Again, like I said, Texas shows you clearly where there's disparity and where minorities were taken advantage of. We can go to Iowa. We've seen 80 and 87 bills and laws and legislation in 29 states that show that there was extra adding on top of laws to make it harder for people to vote. All we're saying is this: check. Yes, we need to have ID in this country. Yes, everyone should be checked. Yes, no one should be, just running out and voting in people's names.
But how do you know? How do you know that people aren't doing that?
Let's make it an equal playing field.
Without ID,
we don't want equality. We want equity.
Reverend Harris, without ID, how do you know that people aren't doing that? How do you know that people aren't walking into the polling places saying the name of someone who they're not and voting in their place? You don't know that if we don't have ID laws.
But people like you all are not bringing all of the real cases where that has happened. So on both sides, we've got to bring the progressive side and the conservative side together to have the conversation, because we can all disagree without being disagreeable. We've got to have a real conversation on what cases and proof do we have on the conservative side
I'm glad you brought that up.
People have used other people's names to vote, but also what cases do we have on the liberal side so we got to show the proof. We got to bring the data to the table.
Right, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I would point our viewers, we are out of time for this segment, but I would point our viewers to our Facebook page. Last night, my final point was on examples of voter fraud, of even perhaps the potential for mass voter fraud here. Very much worth the watch, worth looking at this data. I wish liberals actually would look at the data, because if they do, I think they'd realize there was the potential for it, and that voter ID does not discriminate. But Reverend Harris, we'll have to pick this up because we are out of time for today. Thanks for being here.
Yep.